Hey, this is Ben. Just wanted to give you a brief talk about file formats in Photoshop. In here, I've just opened a random layered file in Photoshop, so we have something to save. I'll go to the File menu, where we have many different choices for saving. Now, one of the choices in here is simply called Save. And save would mean save in the exact same file format, using the exact same name and location that this was originally saved in. And that's grayed out right now because that's not possible to do. But I would therefore have to choose Save As. Save As usually means use either a different file format than the original, a different name, or a different location, or you want all those things to be the same, but you want a copy of the file. So you're going to have two of them. But I'm going to use Save As just because Save is not available. This comes up. And it does ask me where here. That's a standard choice in your operating system of where you want to save things. And right down here is our format. So let's take a look at this menu. Now in this menu there are a bunch of file formats that over 25 years of using Photoshop, I've literally never, ever used. Nor have I ever received a file in those formats. But they're still here, just in case somebody needs them. Let's take a look at what some of those are. There is DICOM. That is used for some things, but not for people that work with normal pictures. IFF format. JPEG stereo. Multi-picture format. PCX. Pixar. Portable bitmap. Cytex CT. To be honest, I used that decades ago, but haven't touched it since. Targa. Those are file formats that I never, ever, ever have to think of. In fact, I really, really wish I could turn them off in this menu to declutter it. And I've begged Adobe to allow me to do that for many years, and they just don't seem to care. So let's look at the file formats that I do suggest you use. When you have a layered Photoshop file, I suggest that you use one of two file formats, and those are Photoshop and the choice called TIFF. There is no quality difference between those two formats. You could almost flip a coin to choose which one you should use. I personally, these days, use TIFF for my layered Photoshop files. Now, there is a slight difference between the two. You'll find TIFF will often allow you to create a smaller file size because it has a different kind of compression. I will use Photoshop in one instance, and that is if I have what's known as a duotone. A duotone would be used only when you print on a printing press using 2, 3, or 4 colors of ink on a grayscale picture. And that's because the duotone file format is not supported in TIFF. So that might cause me to go over here and use Photoshop instead of TIFF for my layered Photoshop files. But otherwise, don't feel bad if you use Photoshop file format. It's no better than TIFF when it comes to quality. The advantage of TIFF, though, is that Photoshop file format has a maximum file size limit of, if I remember correctly, 2 gigabytes, whereas TIFF is 4. That means if you end up working with a crazy high-resolution camera and add gazillions of layers, at some point you might get a file big enough that it can't be saved in Photoshop file format. So you might have to go to TIFF. And if you run into the limitation of TIFF's file format, that 4 gigabyte maximum, and I don't know, maybe you have 300 layers in there, then you might need to use a format called large document format. I wouldn't usually use that unless the other two formats gave me an error message saying this is just way too big to save in my format, because there isn't really any other software I can think of that can open a file that's in large document format. Fine to use it though if you have a really complex file that's massively huge and you're only going to need to open it again in Photoshop. So I think of Photoshop in TIFF as what I would call my working file formats. By working, I mean the next thing I'm going to do is close this file and open it at a later date and continue to work. And I plan on doing that over and over again. When that's the case, I don't want to use any file format that would degrade the quality of my picture. Otherwise, every time I save, close, and reopen it, the quality will go down. Well, Photoshop and TIFF don't degrade the quality of the picture, and they support all of Photoshop's features, so all the layers that I have, the channels and other things, would still be in that file when I open it again. So those are two great working file formats. I mainly use TIFF for my layered files, but don't feel bad if you use Photoshop. You're getting about the same quality and everything else. Now, as far as delivery file formats, that's when I'm done with my picture and I want to send it to somebody else. Then I have a few choices. The most common one would be JPEG. JPEG is not a good working file format. If somebody gives me a JPEG file and I plan on doing additional work to it, saving it, closing it, opening it next week, and doing that over and over again, I would not stay in JPEG file format. Even though my friend sent me a JPEG, I'd open it, I'd start working on it, but when I was done, I'd save it as a TIFF or a Photoshop file format, because that's not going to degrade the quality at all. But JPEG, its primary focus is to deliver a small file size. And in order to do that, it degrades the quality of a file a little bit every time it's saved. I shouldn't say every time it's saved. It's every time you save, close, and then reopen the picture. Because it's when you reopen the picture, that's the only time it actually reads that newly saved data. So JPEG I think of as a lousy working file format, but a great delivery file format because it gives us nice small files. When would I not use JPEG? If I want the absolute highest quality. If I charge $75,000 for my prints, some people do, I wouldn't be using JPEG at all. I'd use TIFF. TIFF is a pretty universal file format, meaning just about any program can open it, and it does not degrade the quality at all. But if you use TIFF, the file size is going to be a lot bigger than JPEG, so for most of the time when I need to deliver a picture to a client, I use JPEG. Let's look at the other file formats that are here and when we want to get away from JPEG as a delivery file format. If I'm going to deliver something that is not a photograph, instead it's a graphic, it's my logo or my signature, then JPEG is less than ideal because JPEG is designed strictly for photographs. If, let's say I'm going to save something for the internet, then I'm going to use JPEG for a photograph, or I'm going to use a choice called GIF or another choice called PNG if it's a graphic, because those are better at reproducing the look of solid colored shapes like logos. And if you were to use JPEG, you would end up with artifacts all over the edges of your logo and things. I think it would look kind of like popcorn spread across the edges of your objects. So if you want to use it for a graphic, I would end up using, for the internet that is, either GIF or PNG, mainly using PNG, PNG. Stands for Portable Network Graphics, and it's a more modern file format than GIF. The only time I'd usually use GIF is if my image contained animation. Now, we haven't covered that in class, so you probably don't know how to do that if you've just been following this class. But that's a feature that's not available in PNG. So let's take a look at other choices that might be in here and anything I'd need to use. On rare occasions for publishing, printing on a printing press, I might have to use EPS. That's primarily when I have what's known as vectors or paths in my document, and I want to limit where my image shows up based on that. But that's a relatively rare use these days. You know, back up 15 years ago, and I might use that on occasion. Other than that, in here, there's not much else that I end up using. Just so you know, a couple of questions I might encounter. There's one called Photoshop RAW, and you might think that that would save your image as a RAW file, but it doesn't. RAW, for most people, means the raw data your camera captured. And the RAW files that most people talk about came directly out of a digital camera. There is no other way to create a RAW file, because otherwise it's not the raw data that came directly out of a camera. If you choose here Photoshop RAW, it's more for scientific purposes. I want to have raw data that I could send to some specialized software. I've never needed to use that choice. but a lot of people ask questions about it because they're used to hearing about RAW files. Now, I should mention if I ever want to use GIF or I want to use PNG for the internet, I don't come to this dialog box, the one called Save As. Instead, I'll go to the File menu. There's a choice here called Export, and there's a choice called Save for Web. And in here, I will find the choice of GIF in PNG. And that's where I'd use it, because here I'm going to find settings that are specialized for use on the internet. One of which is a special checkbox here called Convert to sRGB, which makes sure that the colors would look okay once we get on the internet. But right here is where I can choose between GIF and PNG. Now, when you save files in certain file formats, I'll go back to Save As, you're going to get choices. One of those file formats that's most common is TIFF. If I choose TIFF and I click Save, you get these options. Most of the time, I just leave it at defaults, and it works perfectly fine. There's a lot of choices in here I used to have to use like 20 years ago when we had software that wasn't all that compatible with the files we create. But most of the time these days, there's just kind of legacy settings in here. A couple things you could look at, though. In here, there's a choice down here called Layer Compression. And if I choose one of these, I got to be careful, because if I use anything other than Photoshop and have layers in my file, that other software might not be able to open it if I use one of these specialized settings. But in general, the rest of the settings in here, you can just leave alone and click OK. Also, when you go to Save As, you'll find that certain file formats don't support all the features that you might have used to create your file. So if I choose, for instance, from this menu, JPEG, then you'll find that certain checkboxes over here will have a little warning symbol next to them. And that means that whatever is next to that warning symbol means it will not be included with that file format. And if this image had alpha channels, which are also known as saved selections, you would find the same triangle up there. So be careful when you choose certain file formats if you expect to reopen your picture and have everything that you currently have in it. Choose the file format you desire and then glance to see if there's any of those yellow triangles, knowing that if there are, you might lose that particular feature. And that's why we don't save layered images as JPEGs, because it doesn't understand layers. But if I choose Photoshop file format, you'll find all those triangles disappear. Same with TIFF. So hopefully that gives you some sense for which file formats to use. With layers, it's mainly Photoshop and TIFF. When it comes to delivering images where I'm completely done working on it, most common would be JPEG. Second most common would be TIFF. And if it's for the internet, JPEG for photographs, and usually PNG for graphics.